Let's keep talking in deep about coverages in this game. We already went over quarters and palms, and both of those were in relation to basically 2x2. So we're going to keep doing this. We're going to be keep talking about coverages. We're going to get to trips. We're going to get to empties and bunches and things like that. But for now, we're still sticking with the old 2x2 sets. You know, your doubles, your spreads, even when you think about like the backside of empty, or in some cases it applies to tight as well. In this video we're going to be talking about this new coverage in the game, well, really kind of existing coverage in the game but updated rules, and that is cover 2 match. I already talked about this a little bit in a couple videos ago where we talked about the new patch in the game, or the new title update. And basically where this applies is on the backside of cover 6 or the front side of cover 9. It also applies in some cases with cover 2 blitzes. Unfortunately, there's no coverage in the game that's full on cover 2 match all the way across the board. But basically you're looking for this combination of vertical hook beside a soft squat with a deep half zone over the top, and you may or may not have a 3 receiver hook in the middle. So we're just going to be talking about this side of the field today. We're not going to be talking about how it relates over here with quarters on this side, or how it relates with cover 2 on that side. Only going to be talking about this coverage right here, and really in this video only going to be looking at this twins or doubles look. But I will say that the rules between this and how it plays on trips are pretty much exactly the same. So I may not even do a video for how this coverage plays trips, because really, like, you can think of this as trips. If, like in this case, the back was to the side over here, but really, even whether it's against 2 or against 3, it kind of plays out the same way, because really what cover 2 types of matches are is they tend to be triangle coverages, and in particular how it's implemented in this game, where you have 3 defenders over 2 receivers. And I talked about this kind of these geometries, and in particular the triangle coverages in quarters and palms, and it's even more kind of pronounced in Tampa, where you have a clear bottom left of your triangle, a clear bottom right of your triangle, and a clear top middle of your triangle with a deep half safety right here. Whereas, with quarters, the triangle looks kind of something like this, where you have no bottom left. It's really like a top left, top right, and a bottom right. And then with palms, where it kind of rotates a little bit, where you have kind of a left point, and then you kind of have this asymmetric looking triangle type of thing. With Tampa 2, again, you're matching, but when you think about geometry at a high level, you're really just rotating that triangle, and that can give you a kind of a hint of what's to come in terms of how this actually plays out. Now, before we get into it, I'm a little bit puzzled, to be honest, that first of all, I'm really happy that finally the match rules for the cover 2 side have been updated. For a long time, they've been really quite weak, particularly the vertical hook, where you can easily exploit him and easily get free, deep middle, and for one play scores, whether it's in doubles or trips. There are so many ways of exploiting it. So I'm really happy they're updated. I'm a little bit surprised by how they did it. Basically, what I consider this to be is a version of cover 2 man match, where I would be, they have this thing with cover 6 Willie in the game, where you get this type of thing. What this plays out is more like this, where it's really pretty much man, but you have an opportunity to kind of switch these underneath routes between the corner and the hook, or the apex defender right here, and then you have kind of a safety over the top capping things if basically you're losing leverage, or in some cases it's just too difficult for the switch to happen. The safety's there to kind of cap it and help out. But the way I'm thinking about this coverage is really these guys are in man-to-man, except there is this opportunity switch underneath. And we'll get into it later, but this hook really isn't even in the picture in most cases. So I'm a little bit surprised because they have, cover two man, they have cover six Willie in this game. I'm surprised they didn't apply this to that and really make more of a effort to create a cover two match. You think of things like cut or buster, things like that, that you might have heard in terms of real football. I would have liked to see that here. Because right now, as it stands, and again, we'll get to the rules, but this soft squat, this flat defender, really only comes down on number 2 in the flat. All right, he's never looking at number 3. And really, there are no situations, absolutely no situations, where this guy will ever be in a flat. So that's another situation with kind of play arts. It looks like he's, a soft squat, which is like flat but has an opportunity match. But in this case, he will there's no case as far as I know that he will ever be, in a zone. Whereas, the deep half, okay, there's certain situations where he can match, but, there's quite a few situations where he'll be in this zone. Likewise with the vertical hook, I think he's also pretty much always in man. There might be a couple situations where he kind of zones off to the hook, but in this case, never is this guy in the flat. So I would have preferred this to be for, there's a distinction between matching cover 2 man and matching cover 2. But anyway, it is what it is. So let's just go over what we have right here. Let me just throw this out so we can reset it nicely. Okay. So the rules are, basically, the corner has number 1 man-to-man everywhere he goes. The vertical hook has number 2 man-to-man everywhere he goes. And the safety kind of caps the more vertical of those two, basically. So he's going to be helping out on the more vertical of those two. And in some cases, he might have number 1 man-to-man on his own. And there are some kind of under-the-scenes geometries and distances and calculations that are in play in terms of who and when these things match out. And we'll talk about that I haven't fully understood yet, and I don't think I ever will be able to, but just some things to note there. But the way that you can also think about it is that the vertical hook is truly the bottom left of the triangle, and he'll have the first in. The soft squat is the true bottom right of the triangle, and he'll have the first out. And the deep half is the top of the triangle, and he'll have basically the second in or the second out, depending on how it plays out. So let's go ahead and really quick just show 2 verticals right here. You'll see that the underneath zones match man-to-man, and then the safety is kind of splitting those. So let's look at that right here. In this case, maybe, yeah, so you see outside leverage on the corner. He's the bottom right of the triangle. Inside leverage of the vertical hook, and he's the bottom left of the triangle, and then you have the true top middle, the top half of that triangle. And you'll notice that these underneath, zones, you can't really call them zones in this case, they have kind of a bit of a trail technique right here. They know that, they can play a little bit more aggressive underneath because they have help over the top. Okay, and probably in some situations, they could be even a little bit more aggressive underneath, particularly the soft squat. Maybe not so much the vertical hook, because if this guy is to bend really, truly inside, that can be, a situation where you lose help from the safety. So maybe this is okay. But here, especially when you have the sideline, maybe I would trail off a little bit more, because in situations where, let's say you get a comeback route over here, which is a good way of beating the quarter side, because that corner has no help over the top. In this case, the soft squat does, so I would expect him to play a little bit more underneath, because you can still get this comeback route here, and I would expect this cover 2 matching type of or cover 2 man matching type of coverage would be helping on that. You're stronger underneath and you're stronger outside. I'm a little bit disappointed that you could still kind of get that in. Even like a curl route right here, you can get that in there. So there's is one thing to think about, what are the rules, but it's another thing to think about what is the technique that's actually implemented right here. And sure, you can start thinking about, ratings and abilities and things like that, but I think really you should be able to plug in really any player right here and get really what's the main aspect of the coverage. Now, I think if you press, and that might cause some issues elsewhere, but if you press, I think that naturally gives him more of a trail technique. So I think that should help him play this stuff a bit better. But you see, even the comeback route, you can kind of hit that over and over again. So that's something I'll probably be looking for in the future, getting some knockout abilities right there, because that's, in terms of these match coverages, those comebacks, those outside curl routes, those are kind of free game as far as I see. And then, I think the vertical hook plays pretty well. Like, you can even stem this a little bit more in on like a post or a deep over route, and you'll see that the vertical hook does a nice job of keeping his leverage for the most case. In some cases, you get a weird turn animation, as we did right there. But I think if we run this a few times, you'll see he does a pretty good job. I would still like him to do a better job of like keeping that leverage all the way, because if I have time in the pocket and I have okay, so in this case, actually he did a bit better, but in the end, he still kind of lost a little bit. So there might be a kind of a speed mismatch right there. I'm not sure. Tranquil, he's a linebacker. Taysom Hill is a bit of a speedy tight end, so you might have a bit of a mismatch there. I'm not sure, but anyway, I think he does a pretty good job right there. But then the question is, what happens when you don't have a clear cut vertical, it's clear cut. The vertical hook has the post, the soft squat has the fade right here. What happens when we start switching it up a little bit? So what happens if we have not a vertical route? Well, this doesn't really change the triangle right here, right? You're stretching the bottom left of that triangle, but you're not really stressing any of the other players right here. So the rules are really quite clear cut. And you'll see that the vertical hook will come down and play that man-to-man all the way across the field. And what you'll notice is that he was really quite close. Like, he was covering that really well. Like, maybe you could still have thrown that in there, but would have been a catch and an instant either knockout or tackle, or so you see, like, he's right on that. So he does a great job there. And it's really not too much of a different, let me just swap this so that the quarter side is on the weak side right here. It's not too much different than the quarter flat's responsibility, where he will also cover that bottom inner portion of that triangle. But what I've noticed is that the vertical hook plays a much better technique than the quarter flat does. So you see right here, the quarter flat consistently gives up 5 or so yards. And in this case, he was relying on a bad throw to slow down the receiver. But if that's a good throw, that's a catch and run for many, many more yards. So I like the vertical hook. You can even do things like, a show to coverage alignment, or tuck this guy in more manually so that he has even more leverage and he plays that even better. In this case, it was kind of about the same. But in any case, I think he does a great job at that. So that's great. Now, what happens if things are more complex, right? So it's not, clearly number 2 is number 2 and clearly number 1 is number 1. So what happens if number 2 goes to the flat instead? So this is now where the soft squat, the traditional, we think of a soft squat, he's got number 1 vertical, unless number 2 goes to the flat, then he'll kind of come down on that. And you'll see, oh my God, that was weird. But you see, it takes him a while to come down. So let's try to kind of just wait this out a little bit. You see, he sinks, and then he kind of comes down, and he comes all the way down. So I think the technique here is a little bit strange to me. So obviously, and I've mentioned this a few times in the videos that in the past, quarters and palms and things like that. A lot of this stuff is super subjective in terms of even the rules, but especially the technique of how these defenders play these different route combinations, play their leverage points, everything like that. I think the thinking right here is that you don't want the corner to be super aggressive on the flat, giving up this temporary hole shot right here before the safety can take over. And that's fine. That's fine to me. But the problem is, like, to me, he's going too vertical. I would like him to drop off sooner and allow and have the safety to be more aggressive over, more like kind of palms type of technique, like a 2-read palms type of technique. Right here, the safety is really safe. Like, he's backpedaling a lot, and so that requires the corner to drop and sink more. And then at that point, he's, something like 10, 15 yards off. Right, he's 10 or 15 yards off. So you could easily throw this here, get at the very least 5 yards, maybe 6 or 7 type yards. So I don't really love it. And then on top of that, he really comes down. So I would have liked him, truly kind of in between this region. He kind of doesn't play either of these routes super well. In the end, he comes all the way down. But anyway, just something to consider right there. I think maybe we can run a little out route right here. I wonder if he plays this a little bit differently. Yeah, you see, he plays this a little bit differently. So it kind of depends on if you're running a flat or if you're running the little speed out right there. I think he does that kind of nice job right there. So he sinks, right? He sinks and sinks. So it's, gives the safety a little bit of time to come. But he doesn't go all the way. And so if you were to try to throw this, I think it would be difficult for you. Like, maybe if you have a really nice outside pass lead, you can throw that right here. You could probably squeeze that in there. But in this case, like the flat, like the corner, you can't really expect the corner to truly trap this and pick that off. But, even if this is a catch, it's like 2 or 3 yards rather than what we talked about before, 5, 6, 7 type of yards. So I think if it's a speed out, he plays that pretty nice. If it's a zig, I think he'll ignore it. Let's play it out right here. So you see, because the zig has that initial inside break, I think that'll cause the vertical hook to match that and come back. The one thing I'm surprised about here is the vertical hook really swallows this up. So I would expect that the vertical hook would lose leverage right here. And maybe, again, this is a ratings thing, but I would expect the bottom left of the triangle to stay, bottom left and then to be out leveraged outside. But actually, he plays that really, really well. So yeah, like generally, like double moves like this where you kind of force a match one way and then take advantage of his off leverage the other way are good match beaters. But in this case, we'll take the free win on the defensive side of the ball. So, depending on what this number 2 route is, whether it's a flat or speed out or zig, you see, the corner plays out quite a bit differently, which is kind of interesting to me. Either he doesn't match at all, or he matches early, or he matches late. So that's something to think about. What I like is that they've extended the window a bit. So let's bring this out route to 10 yards. So to 10 yards, that soft squat will still trigger. Whereas I think maybe in previous years, or even if you look at something like palms, he won't come down on that. But in this case, I believe he will come down on that. And you see, then it's truly trapping, right? Then he's really right there. And if you throw that out there, that's either a hospital ball or a pick 6 type of thing. So that's really, really nice. I mean, at a certain point, let's go really deep. Let's go really deep with it. I shouldn't say this is really deep, but a little bit deeper. At a certain point, he will not come down on that, right? So at this point, it's considered vertical route, the vertical hook, the apex defender has that, man-to-man all the way, and he's going to stay with his man all the way. So just like that. And the thinking here is that at a certain point down the field, the further you are down the field, the less of an impact your off leverage will have, right? So let's go something like this, like, sail combination right here. This corner route is deeper and it's less of a sharp route. So the less of a disadvantage that this inside leverage from the apex defender has, and you can just say he's got that man-to-man, he's got help from the boundary, the soft squat doesn't need to help him right there. Now in this case, like this corner route is a little bit kind of in between. It's enough to say the soft squat shouldn't come down on that, but it's also enough that it's sharp enough and it kind of gets into that ratings window. So now it's kind of like who's really better at this case. So I think you can still kind of fit this in right here. And in this case, they swapped after the ball was thrown. But, you know, for like really, really deep corner routes, like those ones that basically would get into the window if this was true Tampa zone, in this case, you know, it's just too difficult to get that in there. And in this case, I got that in anyway, I guess. But, you know, you have to start to think about the ratings of this defender right here and if you can get knockout abilities and things like that. So anyway, all that to say is that just because the rules are nice and solid, right? These guys are matching corner routes, these guys are matching posts and over routes and things like that. You still have to think about the technique. You have to think about it in terms of, you know, actual leverage and what in a real world situation would provide you benefit or disadvantage. And then on top of that, you have to think about how it's actually played out in this game. Because, you know, in some cases, and I showed you a few of them already, even if you have the leverage, the defender can be programmed to potentially lose the leverage or vice versa. You know, I showed you that zig route where we're off leverage, but we're making it up for whatever case, whether it's just, you know, poor physics in the game or whatever. You have to think about what actually turns out in this game. But I think for the most part, it's pretty good. But obviously, there's still some windows to throw things in there. And then hopefully you can tighten those up by knowing the leverage situation. Okay, so we've talked a lot about what happens if number 2 is going out and all the different ways that he can kind of go out. What happens if number 1 goes in? So if number 1 goes in, you kind of get a similar situation right here, where now the hook will come down because he's got better leverage on, say, an underneath route from number 1 than the soft squat does. So you see he comes down here and he plays this pretty well. In the end, he kind of gets lost in the jungle of all the players in the middle of the field. So like he started off pretty good, right? So he has better leverage to kind of come down on this. And he does a pretty good job right here, but you have like 3 players right here. So you get a little bit of a bump, unfortunately. This is a pretty big problem in the game. Just how these defenders kind of avoid each other. And then he gets a bit of a pick. And now what's half a yard spacing turns into 2 or 3. And then, you know, you can easily throw this and get upfield. So you got to hope that, you know, you don't get this type of situation. I would prefer this quarter flat to not sink in so much, right? His responsibility is if he's not matching anyone on his side, he will drop to his basically a curl flat defender. And so he's drifting way too far inside to the hook region. He should kind of stay here and be ready to help on anything kind of coming across the field. In this case, not only does he not help, he actually makes that more open. So that's a little bit of a aside, I guess. We're not talking about the quarter side of things, but, you know, even though in, you know, true split field coverages where we're just talking about the right side of the coverage, the other side does come into play, for better or for worse. Now, this vertical hook won't always come down on those number 2 inside routes, right? So it depends on what kind of comes first. What is the first route threatening the bottom left corner? So in this case, let's go double in. Where are we at? Double in right here. And maybe I'll just make this a little bit more realistic like this. So in this case, the first route threatening the bottom left is no longer number 1, it's number 2. So the vertical hook is still going to match that drag across the field. And now, because there's no more bottom left of that triangle, the soft squat actually has to play man-to-man. So in this case, you're going to get man-to-man all the way across the board. And funny enough is that the soft squat actually plays this really well. And let's go back to multiple drags. The soft squat plays this really well. Yeah, maybe it's the difference between a drag. Maybe it's the difference between a drag and the in route. But in any case, you see, like, you can exploit the geometry of the match coverage by sending two routes in one way, right? So probably not two routes to the flat because the boundary's right there. Probably not two routes vertical because you have the safety capping things. But certainly two routes inside. You know, the inside guy probably isn't going to get open because the vertical hook has great leverage right there. But then, as I showed you, you know, the backside guy can find a way to beat his leverage, and you can throw that in there. So yeah, but now let's talk about if, you know, these gray areas. So obviously if, you know, number 2 is vertical, he's not threatening the inside. And so now the vertical hook will come off on this number 1 drag. And obviously in this case, it's not the case. But what about these intermediate cases? So it now kind of depends into this kind of, there's some kind of distance and geometry calculations behind the scenes. But basically it's which route threatens the vertical hook first. So let's see how it plays out. So in this case, the post happens before that drag can come to him. And so he's covering that post and not coming down on that drag underneath. Let's, I think if we extend this a little bit, let's even extend it just 5 yards. So in this case, a little bit different. And so you see he comes off. And I think this changes depending on the spacing of number 1 and 2, and obviously depending on the field and boundary. So I think this will play out a little bit differently if this is, you know, if those receivers are initially closer together or initially further apart. So you as a user, I think this starts to get pretty complicated because it's not super clear when you're supposed to match and when you're not supposed to match, because there are some distance considerations into play. So if you are to say man up on the vertical hook, if you're to user that vertical hook, it could be quite difficult for you, because what's the difference? Like, should I be matching on the 5-yard post, the 10-yard post, the 15-yard post, you know, and which one in between? And is it if I'm on the field or boundary? Really quickly, it can start to get pretty complicated there. So that's something to consider, is that these like really matchy coverages, not like zone match, more like true man matchy, whereas like these guys are always covered no matter what. It can be really, really difficult for you to help there. So in this case, like, unless, you know, you could probably be somewhere else on the field, but if you're truly, thinking about who the user of these guys, probably the deep half is your best bet, to be honest for you. But even then, and we'll get to that, there's some strange things. Shouldn't say strange, but difficult considerations there. But you see right here, you get this swap, and you know, I showed you before where you have the double drag and the corners out leverage. This is an even more difficult case. And in the end, actually, I think because Taysom Hill's route running really isn't great, it's not that bad. Like, this corner, if he's good, could maybe undercut a throw. But, you know, he's got a step, and if the quarterback throws it over here, that could be a score. I would like this safety to get more involved. In this case, like, the way I think of this safety is that he should play the second in or the second out. So he should see immediately, if he sees somebody threatening the bottom left, he should change his leverage point, right? So he's supposed to split number 1 and 2. So he's splitting them, but now they cross. So I would like this safety to play right here and cap the more vertical guy. So rather than playing right above this post and helping his trail corner, he's basically just drifting and playing nothing. So as I showed before, you know, in terms of defending the sideline hole shot, where he's maybe a bit passive, in this case, he's just not in the picture. So I would like that safety to get much more involved, but either that's a programming thing or the developers think like, oh, this guy really should be a deep half, because what if there's a post on this side? And that's another consideration, really. Like, I would think that, you know, the inside leverage of this safety right here, he doesn't need help from this guy. He's got him, you know, he's got him covered for any sort of anything running this way. So I would like that safety to come down because, again, this is split field coverage. Like, he should be helping out on maintain the integrity of the triangle geometry of the defense. He shouldn't just say, okay, I'm done. My play's over. I'm just going to go hang out over here. So that's a bit of a disappointment. How else can we show this? Maybe we'll try a deep over. I think in this case, because, again, it cuts inside, even though it ends up being really a vertical route, it cuts inside quite quickly. So I think the vertical hook is going to stick on it. So yeah, he does a good job sticking on it, and that's a difficult throw. You can maybe, use your body strength from the tight end right here to still catch that ball, but I think the vertical hook did a great job of covering on that. Let's also talk about this situation. Back to number 2 flat, but now number 1 is breaking inside. Actually, let's let him break inside early. So he breaks inside early. In this case, it's a simple, easy swap. The corner has leverage on the flat, and the vertical hook has leverage on the in. They swap. In this case, we had bad locomotion issue. So in reality, there's no reason why he should have got beat on that in the game. He did get beat on that. Let's maybe run something maybe a little bit more realistic, like slant flat. Let's see how he does. In this case, he does better, but still he kind of gets beat. Pressure came. I wasn't able to throw that, but normally you should. So there are situations where, again, in reality, it makes sense that the leverage works out in the game, because of just how locomotion works and all of that. He kind of gets beat there. But again, I think, depending on his zone rating, he could probably transition better. But in this case, obviously it wasn't good enough. Now, what happens if we extend that a little bit? So we talked about slant flat. What about flat post or post flat? So in this case, the vertical hook does match the post, right? If this is a fade ball, he's not going to match him. This is the safety's job at this point. So the safety has that fade. But if that number 1 is to break inside on the post, then the vertical hook will cover that. And I think he does a good job right here. So he does actually a wonderful job. So that's completely, and in this case, the speed of Cooks, ultimately it's also just a matchup thing, right? The coverage was great, but in the end, you have a speedy receiver against a linebacker. In some cases, this guy could be a nickel defender or what have you. But in this case, he's a linebacker. So in the end, even if he has good initial coverage, there's also the speed consideration, right? Now, depending on, and I still haven't figured it fully out yet, but there are situations where the vertical hook doesn't match number 1, and it's the safety matching above him. I think in this case, those receivers are so close. Okay. So in this case, this is exactly what I wanted to show. Perfect. So again, there are some triangulations behind the scene that we don't know, but to a certain level, it doesn't make sense anymore for the vertical hook to match that because it's so deep, and it makes more sense for the safety to come down on that. Okay, so I would still say, that in this case, no matter where number 1 is cutting from, that the vertical hook and the safety should both play him. It shouldn't be that, if he's super vertical, it's just the safety, or if he's more shallow, it's just the vertical hook. I would say, especially if it's this 10-yard glance, 15-yard glance, I would say, why not? You have both of these guys. Why not use them? Why not have the vertical hook underneath and to the left and the safety over top and to the left, inside? But in this case, it's at least nice that, they have this consideration where, the safety can get involved. He's not just a dumb deep half. There are situations where he can take over and play man-to-man. So there are some niceties of it for sure. Okay, so I think that's pretty much it in terms of coverage. Again, there are some complexities in terms of leverage, in terms of when you get trade-offs, depending on how far away the defenders are, that can make it really difficult for you to user. But really, at the end of the day, it's just a triangle, and it's like a, what is it, like equilateral? I forget my trigonometry, but really bottom left, bottom right, and then you have the top middle of it. And for the most part, I think they match really well, even though I think of this more suited to something like Willy, where the coverage art looks like this. But I think in general, play art needs overhaul. Okay, so that's really that. Let's reset this. I want to talk about one more coverage consideration before we get into the run considerations and wrap this video up. When we get a third receiver in, okay, let's float the back. When we get a third receiver in, he has basically the triangle doesn't consider him at all. So really what you're getting is the 3 receiver hook is man to man on this running back wherever he goes, whether he breaks inside, whether he is on a little option route, whether he's outside, whether he's, and this is kind of difficult to do, or he's like directly vertical up the seam. This three receiver hook is going to have him man to man. So right here you see it kind of plays out as 2-man under, where you have, you know, the underneath guys all man to man on 1, 2, and 3, and then the deep half safety capping that. And let's float him again. Let's go this way. You'll see okay. So I was hoping to show you that next, but surprisingly that came up in this situation. So there is a situation where you can get a push call from the 3 receiver hook to the vertical hook where they can basically swap. Now in this case, I've actually never seen this before, where they're pushing the back even though the back is going the other way. And so this is a bug I haven't seen before. So obviously in this case, you know, especially since the deep half is kind of, in this case, just a cap, this guy's running free deep middle of the field. But basically what I wanted to show is that if number 1 and 2 are close enough, or sorry, if number 2 and 3 are close enough, and I wasn't sure if this case would be the case, then the 3 receiver hook will pass the back off to the vertical hook. Okay, and in this case it didn't happen. So so that's why I was especially confused by the last situation. So I don't know why that happened. But in this case, you see number 3, the hook, the vertical hook has number 3 man to man. And in this case, like just the initial alignment of the coverage is pretty bad. And so he's really off leverage. So I would think that the vertical hook would come off and they would swap number 2 and 3. Or if this was true matching cover 2, actually the flat would come down on it. But, you know, again, this is more of a matching cover 2 man. So the swap would come between the hook and the apex on 2 and 3 rather than getting the corner involved. But in this case, he didn't. I still haven't fully figured out when they do it. Let's try it to the field. But yeah, there are situations where you can get this swap. So not in this case. Let's just do one more thing before I kind of close this out. Let's go to, oops, I didn't want to do that. Let's go back to cover 6 and let's go to gun doubles. Let's go for verticals. Let's try it in this case. So I think in this case they will swap. Yeah, so right there. So again, it kind of depends on, I think it's less so the distance between the receivers. I think it's more so the distance between the defenders. So in this case, you would think that the vertical hook has 2 vertical, but in this case, just because the back, you know, strongly out leverages the hook, it just makes more sense to swap those guys. Now then, if number 2 or now the new 3 were to run a sharp corner, you see like this soft squat will never be able to help on him, and this hook defender doesn't have the leverage, and this guy's capping everything. So you see how this can be a really easy way to out leverage this guy. So as soon as you kind of get into the box situation where you have 4/3, then it's much more difficult to kind of match everything. Again, you think about this ratio of 4/3 not being as much as 3/2. So the strong side is always going to be more difficult to match. So although, this kind of bending, middle route is nicely covered by the hook, if you were to break outside, he has all of this space right here to exploit the defense. So some considerations there. The other thing is that actually, I think in this case, if you're using the 3-receiver hook, that swap won't occur. So you see the vertical hook takes them, and then you have to go there. So that's something to consider. If you're using the 3-receiver hook in these man-matching cover 2, you have number 3 man-to-man no matter where he goes, and especially in trips where I haven't seen this push, this swap between the two hooks over here. Okay, so let's talk about really briefly some of the run considerations, and I'll probably be talking about this more in terms of the run game stuff more in future videos, but I just want to, while we're already here, talk about the run game consideration. Let's go inside zone. So now you have, over here, you have the ability, even though the safety is in the fit and quarters, the true nicety here, I guess, is that you have a true flat defender. So this guy can be more active in terms of the run game. And especially when you have quarters or palms to both sides, you're basically fitting the box no matter what. And sometimes you have leverage considerations. I highlighted those in palms, but you're fitting the box no matter what. Now, when you have the man matching cover 2, where you have no true flat defender, and that kind of free, that +1 is the deep half, this guy is, no matter what, going to be out of the picture. So you cannot get him involved in the run game. So now, what does this look like? We're playing quarters on the other side of cover 6. We have no option to get the cover 2 on one side and palms on the other side. So this flat defender has to cover everything over here. So he really, you can't think of him as in the box. Like, he can't really get involved because he'd be strongly conflicted. Okay, likewise, okay, the corner, the corner's never really in the picture. Well, that was kind of cool. What happened there? Huh. Never really saw that before. Now he's kind of glitched out. But the safety also, he's got number 2 man-to-man vertical. You can't really consider him in the picture. So now you have 2 gaps for this overfront in the middle that need to be filled. And obviously one of those is the hook, and he can pick one of those. But then who's going to fill the other one? So if he's the B gap defender right here, who's the A gap defender? Is it this vertical hook? Not only is he, way far away from that A gap, but he has to take number 2 vertical, right? You have these guys all potentially vertical. You have this guy potentially vertical. You have this guy potentially vertical. And then this guy has to cover the flat. So you are truly, light in the box in this situation, where with 2 high quarters, you can play around with, tucking in the palms flat, or depending on if there's a tight end involved, you can maybe get one of these safeties into the box. But in this case, you are truly, light in the box. And you as a user, if you're this guy, you have to cover the A gap and the B gap, and that's a really difficult assignment. So that's something you have to start to think about. Now, the way that, and let me just reset this play, the way that I would, play soundly with these cover 2 matching type of defenses is I would pair them up with something like 3-3 odd, or if you're playing college, you have like mint and tight fronts, where you're basically tucking in one side of your defensive line. So you still have on one side, you have a C gap defender, you have a B gap defender who's more of like a 4-eye technique. You have a middle linebacker, you have a head up nose. So already you have the C gap, B gap, the 2 A gaps, and then this guy, rather than being an edge defender, he's another 4-eye in the B gap. And what that allows you to do then is that it allows you to get one of these vertical hooks kind of in the fit. where, especially we can very quickly hot route into cover 2 on both sides. And now, because this vertical hook is the bottom inner portion of the triangle, and he's naturally inside between, in this case, between the tackle and number 2, you can tuck this guy in, and this guy's run fit aligns with his coverage responsibility, right? So he can basically play inside, and depending on what number 2 is doing. Now, that's not super foolproof as like a hard edge, but at least you can be a little bit more gap sound in this case. Now, you could, as I've mentioned, before, if this was palms, where, this guy comes down to play the flat, to help in the flat, and now this quarter flat can tuck in, and he can play this B gap right here, allowing this middle linebacker to play the A gap. So you can do that as well. But, when you think about the true differences between man matching cover 2 and man matching palms, where they both have this element of the corner coming down to help the flat. So you could think about like, what's really the difference here? Like, they're both kind of some sort of matching cover 2. The difference is who's your free defender when things go vertical. When things go vertical on quarters, you're 2-on-2. And you have a free flat defender. When things go vertical on the cover 2 side, you're 3/2, right? All of these guys are going vertical right here. And so really it's difficult to get these guys involved in terms of the run fit, unless it's a situation where I showed you where you don't have an edge defender right there and this guy can kind of play both. But you can never get this situation like with the palms quarter flat where he has absolutely no vertical responsibility, so he has more leeway in terms of the run fit. Okay? And so there's certain situations where even if you're playing cover 2 match on both sides, that you can, be gap sound, and that usually requires something like a tight front or odd front type of thing. And we'll get into that in future videos, but it makes the consideration much more down to down based, depending on the offensive formation, and there's more difficulty there. Like, you can be gap sound playing cover 2, but it's more difficult to achieve, I guess. Whereas when you have quarters, or at least quarters on one side, you're mostly always going to have that +1 defender, and you can be generally safe with things. But yeah, once you start to get into these deep halves, things get more difficult to consider. And lastly, but certainly not least, is the quarterback run game. Especially if you're playing cover 2 on both sides, you can get into a situation where, let's say you're playing 4 verticals, you can get into a situation where you're basically playing everyone deep, right? So if we're playing 4 verticals against man matching full on cover 2, what you're going to get is 3/2 on both sides. And let's say even the back swings out and this 3 receiver hook goes out with the back. Then what you have right here is you basically have a late stage run game. You have a late stage run game where you have 5 blockers against 4 defenders, and basically you have multiple gaps to run through. In this case, depending on how it lines up, in this case, just because it's a straight rush, the quarterback can escape through the A gap or the B gap. In this case, I don't think Rattler is like the fastest guy, and I'll probably still get hung up behind the line, but there are gaps there to run through, right? Okay, I moved the 3 receiver hook before the play, but he would push out with the back anyway. And so you could escape either through here. In this case, maybe what I tried with the B gap made more sense, but Rattler isn't the quickest, most agile guy. So before I tried to escape, the nose got to me. So that's where things get even more tricky. It's not just with the regular run game, but it's the quarterback run game. It's your options, your RPOs, it's your late stage scramble run game as well. And so that's also a consideration. And so at this point, if you're playing more man on the back end, whether it's pure man or man match, just the straight rush is kind of difficult. So you have to think about, should I either I just, live with it. Obviously you don't want to do that. Maybe you have to get one of these guys involved in a spy, and maybe then this opens up the need for, say, a 3-down type of defense where that spy can be off the ball, like a linebacker or a DB or something like that. And that's certainly possible this year with 3-man rushes actually eventually getting in. Or this year you have the ability to add stunts in. And stunts don't change the picture, right? You're still, at a disadvantage with 4 defenders against 5 blockers in terms of the QB run game, but it at least makes the picture more difficult for the quarterback, where pre-snap you can see, okay, I likely have some lane in the middle, whether that's through the A gap or B gap or both. But once you get stunts involved, then that just muddies the picture for the quarterback, and it just makes it a little bit more difficult. But you're still at a man disadvantage in that case. So we'll talk about that in future videos, like how important it is to pair the coverage with the run assignments, and not just regular run game, but quarterback run game, option run game, scramble run game. But those are just some things to consider for now. Okay, really long video, but I hope you guys enjoyed it. We'll come back. I'm not sure what I'll do next, but next week we'll do another coverage. See you guys then.